welcome everybody. To those of us who are joining us for this discussion. Thank you to our panelists and all of the attendees who are joining us today and for being here. Just so everyone is aware, in terms of our panelists, this panel will be recorded and uploaded online. Attendees, you will not be seen in this recording, but our panelists will. And if you'd like to revisit this after this panel discussion, you're more than welcome to go visit that recording online on our YouTube channel. Our panel today is hosted by Pollack Peacebuilding Systems. Pollack Peacebuilding Systems is a conflict resolution consulting company focused on helping companies establish practices that foster greater peace, collaboration, and productivity. And you can learn more about our services and mission on our website at pollackpeacebuilding.com. The focus of our panel today is creating workplace peace, mitigating risk, and managing conflict in organizations. My name is Noah Shaw, and I currently serve as the Peace Operations Coordinator at Pollack Peacebuilding Systems. And I'll be your co-moderator today along with Alexis. And Alexis, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Yeah, of course. So my name is Alexis Shaw. I'm a current graduate student at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro in the Peace and Conflict Studies Department. And I am also the current Peace Operations intern with Pollack Peacebuilding Systems. Thank you,
Alexis. And so in order to be transparent today about how we're going to spend our time, I'm going to quickly go over the layout of our panel. First, we're going to introduce our panelists so you can get to know a little bit more about them and their background and where they're coming from. Next, we're going to jump into some questions regarding our topic that we're going to go into address to each panelist, allowing conversation to ensue. After this, the floor is going to be open to a Q&A session. If at any point during this panel you think of a question to ask or something one of our panelists says interests you, feel free to type in your question to the question tab at the bottom of your screen or into the chat box, and we'll do our best to get that answered and address it. Alexis and I will both be moderating this chat box, and we'll be doing our best to just monitor that throughout the session. So first, we're going to just get into some panelist introductions here, and I'd like to start just by introducing Sarah Jekovic. Sarah is a peace builder and currently serves as the process facilitator with Pollack Peacebuilding Systems. She holds a master's degree in peace building and conflict transformation from the School for International Training. Her past experience in behavioral health and trauma-informed care working across cultures plays a vital role in her work today as a peace builder. She is passionate for social justice and viewing conflict as an opportunity for growth. Thank you for being here, Sarah.
All right, and I'll be introducing Terrell Holmes. Terrell Holmes holds a master's in organizational development. He focused on building organizational health through advanced interpersonal communication. Through his company, The Good Org, he provides individual coaching for emerging executives, team coaching and facilitation, two-party mediation, and organizational development across various industries. He lives and works in Oakland, California. His post-lockdown plans are to skydive and meet his new nieces. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Holmes.
Next, I'm going to introduce John Miles. John Miles graduated from Emory University School of Law in 1988. He practiced law at the litigation firm Fain, Major & Brennan in Atlanta from 1988 through 1999. In 1999, he exclusively devoted his law practice to alternative dispute resolution and founded Miles Mediation and Arbitration Services in 2000. He currently serves as CEO at Miles Mediation. Miles has 51 neutrals on its panel with offices throughout the southeastern United States. Thank you for being here, Mr. Miles.
Jeremy Pollack is the founder of Pollack Peacebuilding Systems. Jeremy holds a master's degree in evolutionary anthropology from California State University, Fullerton, as well as a master's degree in negotiation, conflict resolution, and peace building from California State University, Dominguez Hills. As a conflict resolution consultant, Jeremy has mediated conflicts between couples, co-executives, and organizations, aiming as often as possible to transform relationships and create win-win resolutions for all parties involved. He also works as a personal development coach, helping individuals discover internal conflicts, impeding them from living happy, fulfilled lives. Thank you, Jeremy Pollack, for joining us today. So for our first question, this will be for Sarah. So where does creating workplace peace start?
Loaded question, right? So my philosophy follows the notion that peace starts from within. And to be clear, peace does not mean that there is no conflict, right? Or opposing views, but rather the ability to remain curious and open to hearing other perspectives without completely like altering one's state of being. So really being grounded. And so if we look at an organization as a whole, peace starts within the structure, right? The policies and the culture that make that organization. So it's the foundation, really. I think of, asking questions like, how do employees communicate with one another? Are there mechanisms in place to really know your team? How does an organization illustrate and support the uniqueness of each individual and how they add to the collective whole, right? Are all voices offered the opportunity to be heard? And how does the organization foster growth, right? Are there opportunities for growth? How do they initiate change? Who has the decision-making power? And is that clear across all staff roles? So I think that shines a big light on leadership and who has that decision-making power? How did they cultivate the team environment? So while much of the foundation and structures stem from leadership, it doesn't all weigh on them, right? It doesn't always weigh on leadership to continue fostering a peaceful work environment. I mean, everybody plays a role, right, to make up the whole. No rhyme intended. But with this topic of mitigating risk and really managing, workplace conflict, I can't help but feel that it does start with the structures and the policies that are put in place and the culture that is created to support those structures and policies. So, of course, these can change, right? And they should, as we're constantly growing and evolving as a species. So too should our systems and structures. But I do think that by having a culture that kind of embraces growth and change and open or inclusive communication within an organization, then we're bound to kind of mitigate risk and do more preventative work, for future conflicts that could eventually lead to harm.
Sarah, what you're referring to a lot, it seems like, the way that I think about peace sometimes, especially in organizations, is how is this organization serving the psychological needs of its members or of its workforce? And it sounds like some of those things you were talking about, open communication, hearing people's input, giving them a space to be heard, and then all kinds of things like, promoting career growth, promoting a healthy level of autonomy, all that sort of thing is sort of getting at, how does an organization serve those basic psychological needs? And you whether you frame it through a needs framework like that or not, a lot of companies, I think, frame it through employee engagement, employee satisfaction, those sorts of frameworks. But what are you actively doing to, sort of gauge how that's going and then adjust and evolve, like you said? Does that seem relevant to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key to, my understanding of it is how committed are you to evolving and changing and growing? Because when we look at conflict, a lot of times what those underlying needs, as you're speaking to, like what needs to happen is kind of expanding our box or our frame, right? Our lenses, and that's learning something new or changing a little bit of our perspective or our current belief system. So if we have a culture that has already kind of fostered that type of environment where it's safe and there's space to do that and it's encouraged, then you're bound to experience less conflict that leads to harm, right? Because like my philosophy is that conflict is not something bad, right? It's an opportunity for that growth and change. So if an organization has an environment that honors that and kind of and illustrates it and welcomes it, then less harm, right? So mitigating risk so that there's less harm.
Sarah, what I love is that you really think about that big organizational level. And like when Alexis introduced me, I'm really thinking about that lower kind of individual and one-to-one, more interpersonal level. And I feel like in compliment, if somebody gives you that structure and says, hey, here's a place where you can speak, it's up to the individual to also participate in that and to put that courage out there. And I think that, at least from that side, it starts with evaluating, being mindful, having a mindful dialogue, even intrapersonally, and understanding what's driving me. Is it my concern for the organization, or is it my ego? And I think starting at that place on an individual level makes you able to participate in that greater container.
Yeah, Terrell, you're making me think of it's like the nested theory, right? Where there's, you have this, basically that's illustrating that you have the problem at hand, an interpersonal conflict, right, between two employees. But that is nested in larger structural, societal issues, right? And conflicts that don't always, they're not necessarily going to be, illustrated and out on the table, but there's underlying needs, as Jeremy points out, that are rooted in those larger structures. So when it comes to the workplace, if we have those policies, procedures, and structures in place to foster dialogue about these things, it's going to help with the interpersonal conflicts.
Yeah. It's hard for interpersonal conflicts to be mitigated when the system doesn't support a sort of like what we might call a peace process, or a conflict resolution process. And when systems are very rigid and not evolving or kind of resistant to change, it really is a setup for more conflict. And I would just, maybe just to put this in a practical term, if people don't, well, I don't know how practical this is, but if people don't trust that anything's going to change, if people don't trust that the status quo, that the organization is willing to shake the status quo if it notices a problem, people are going to be way less willing to speak up about anything, and conflicts will fester, and resentment kicks in, and that kind of stuff, and that presents a whole range of risks. And so I think when there's more transparency and trust in the system, in terms of we're willing to change and we're willing to alter things if we hear feedback, then if that's what's being promoted and it's actually being evidenced, then I think more people will be trusting, and then it's up to the individuals to kind of take whatever opportunities there are to speak up or get their voices heard, and let people know, or let the organization know what I'm experiencing here. But again, they have to feel trusted. They have to feel trust, and they have to feel safe in order to do that won't be retaliated against, and that actually something will be done about it, if appropriate, and if enough people speak up.
And that's the culture, right? That would encompass the culture of the organization. But where does that start from? Which is why I'm kind of like, without putting all the weight on leadership, it really does stem from the leader who created the organization, who set the bar, or built the foundation. It's not always one person, right? Sometimes it's a shared leadership, and the trust has to stem from the top.
Yeah. Sarah, one of the things I like to do because as consultants, we don't know if we're effective until after we leave, right? A lot of the time you come back and you do the post assessments, but it's up to them to do the work. So one of the things I like to do when I'm answering an RFP or having initial discussions with a client is let them know, before we start, I need to have a commitment from a senior executive that they are going to be holding other people accountable. I need that commitment, because otherwise I leave and it makes me look ineffective as a consultant. But even more so, you're not going to be able to drive culture change, that big culture change from the top.
Well, we've seen it over and over where we come in because someone brings us in because two employees are having a problem, and we help those employees figure out or how to get along better and stuff. but then nothing changes from leadership, and leadership's not willing to look at themselves. They're not willing to change anything. Everything's fine here. It's just those two people are having a problem. But that's not usually the case. And when they're resistant to change, it's really tough to maintain peace.
Yeah. And these interpersonal issues, again, back to like that nested theory, as it's always rooted in something larger. I can't help but feel that a lot of times we get organizations that are asking for services that say there's an interpersonal, oh, it's communication issues, it's, it's style, they're not getting along, but really there's deeper structural matters that are at play contributing to the one-on-one conflict.
Yeah, I think really, really good discussion here. And I'd like to shift gears a little bit and just kind of redirect a question to Terrell next. Just what communication practices should organizations consider to help prevent conflict within teams?
So there are a number of things. I have a sort of model in my head of how organizations can put practices into place, and they go around courage, grace, humility, and learning. But the whole thing starts with basic dialogue. These things that we've learned over and over again. So saying things like I statements, I feel, and putting that emotion out there, taking ownership of that for yourself, and not necessarily putting blame on somebody else, assuming that they have the best intentions. These are some of the practices. Going in and saying, admitting that I feel this way, and it's because I have this assumption. That sort of starting there, and then going into those basic listening skills. I'm going to confirm what you say. I'm going to reflect what you say. I'm going to think about it, take it in and pause, and then I'm going to respond. But along with that, you've got to build. So underneath, you get into some deeper things where you have to have courage to act. You have to give them, like Sarah said, you have to provide this container, right? So the practices you want to put into place within that container, let people know, take the courage to act. But a big part of that is that, Jeremy, like you're talking about, that trust and safety, where the person receiving that courageous statement or action needs to accept it gracefully. And what that means is not automatically shooting back to this person some angry response or something like that. I like to say, feel the emotion, don't be the emotion. So state it. I'm angry, and I'm angry because of this. But that doesn't mean you have to yell or stomp your feet or anything like that. And then once you get that response, you give it in a graceful manner, thinking about taking a compassionate approach and thinking about, who is this person? You've seen their TKI, and you know that they're a competing person, passive person, whatever, giving them a response that works for them. And then that humility, so you're responding or you're taking it in, have some humility and be open to the idea of, I might need to change. I want to take these communications and really think about, do I need to change? If I change, how does this work? And then the last piece of that, I think that the last practice is integration. So building that learning, Sarah, I think you talked about sort of a learning organization, or being open to learning. So maybe this whole discussion we just had, how do I take that and then operationalize it, put it into action? And if you disagree with it, that's fine, but be courageous and start the circle again. I disagree with this, and be willing to say that. When people are willing to say I heard from somebody recently, I wrote this down, what is it? When they care enough to say the very worst. When somebody cares enough to say the very worst, then you know that whatever they're telling you is the truth. That's where that trust and safety is going to come from. So the practice I have is speak courageously, receive it gracefully, be humble and open to what the response is, and lastly, be willing to learn, maybe modify or adapt.
Terrell, one thing that dawns on me is the sort of I think there's dramatic need for training. I mean, there's a lot of people are undertrained, especially in leadership. As people get promoted because they're technically good at their jobs, but they don't always get promoted because they're good leaders necessarily, and they don't learn how to be good leaders without training. So, I mean, this kind of framework is so important for people to understand and learn. How do I interact compassionately? How do I interact gracefully? Like, you know, so I think it highlights the need for that. And then again, I kind of circle back to this idea of like, it feels to me like it starts with leadership, because leadership does have to create a safe space where people feel like they can speak up and that they won't be, you know, yelled at for being courageous, but that they'll actually be responded to gracefully when being courageous. And leaders have to model that and create that space. And not just like leadership at the top, like mid-level managers too, like anybody who has direct reports has to model for their team. It's okay to talk here. And maybe one way of going about that is like we're talking about people being able to voice how they feel about certain things. You know, I think to start that modeling, managers need to ask, how do you feel? They need to have these private one-on-ones and create a space where it's like, this is okay to talk about. How do you feel in your job? How did you feel about that meeting last night? You can be honest with me, you know, and then show them what a graceful response looks like, and start creating that atmosphere.
Yeah. Giving permission, I think, that's a big part of it. And I talk a lot as I'm talking to emerging executives about working with their new team, thinking more like a leader versus just a supervisor, really giving permission to people to say, getting into assertiveness and boundaries, right? You have permission to say no and give me a pushback, but it's a no, not right now. So you open it up to negotiation. Yeah. And, you know, sometimes it might come down to, this is just what I need, but I want you to give me that pushback and to tell me what you need based on your boundaries. And it's up to me to enter into that negotiation with you. And it's so needed, like you said, from our leaders.
Yeah. It's tough too. It's tough when especially if you're a leader and you want to start this practice and you start hearing feedback that is kind of uncomfortable for you, and you putting yourself in that position as a leader to say, I'm going to respond gracefully. I'm going to stay calm and be respectful. And even though if I feel defensive, I have to figure out as a leader how to respond without being, if you're a leader responding defensively, this whole thing's out the window. Like there's not gonna be any trust or safety that anyone can give you feedback. So.
Yeah, and back to those basics that we've all learned, right? Of reflect back what that person said, think on it before you respond, ask clarifying questions. So it's that basic practice that a lot of us have been learning since we first stepped into the professional workplace.
Yeah.
I think even because that encompasses a lot, right? We're asking people to communication. It sounds really simple, but it's not when you're saying, take it in, control your emotions, control your reactions, respond with grace. Again, always easier said than done, because when we feel defense or we feel an emotion that's like overpowering our ability to remain at peace and stay grounded and calm. So I feel like I love what you're saying, Terrell, with like your circle and what encompasses having kind of constructive communication. Like what stood out to me was like, what's the intention of the communication? So if you're in like, and that could be like a simple, make sure that your intention is like, I would frame it, when we want to have a peaceful environment, make sure that the reason that you're communicating is to gain understanding, not to tell or show someone your side, or you know what I mean? Like the intention should be, I want to understand. I want them to understand me, but I also want to understand them. So mutual understanding, right?
100%.
And
yeah, and I think about that as the ego versus community concern, or the organizational concern. Is it just because I need to win this? Or is it because I need to understand this so that, excuse me, I know that we're taking the organization in the right direction? I totally agree with you. But you also mentioned it seems hard, right? And that's where we get into the training aspect and all these little things. So for example, when somebody tells you something that's really hard for you to hear, or you're not ready to have a conversation, excusing yourself and out of the room for just 2 minutes. Unless you're a first responder, you can excuse yourself for 2 minutes to go to the bathroom,
Yep.
do your
Yeah.
breathing exercises, collect yourself, and then come back to the conversation. So it's hard. It's a set of practices, and practices mean you practice. They don't just show up one day. But you're right. It's not easy, and it takes a reframing in a different mindset.
Really great discussion and points raised, guys. We're going to go ahead and let John have the floor with the next question, which is, what legal considerations should organizations consider to mitigate risk due to conflict?
Yeah. So when I was, thinking through this question, I spoke with two of my neutrals who exclusively do employment mediation. And just so folks that are listening understand, 99% of what we do is after litigation has already been initiated. So my neutrals are working with sides that are represented. And any business owner or really insurer will tell you, if you get to that point, mistakes have been made. I think, all of them would benefit from hearing what you guys have had to say to date. Michael Russell out of my Nashville office, he said that he thinks that 90% of litigation would evaporate if companies invested in hiring someone who was experienced and well-trained in HR. He said that, too often you promote from within and someone becomes HR director, but they don't have any training in conflict resolution. They don't have any knowledge of policies, procedures, the law when it comes to discrimination, harassment. So putting that person in place is the first step. And then Steve Dunn, who works out of our Charlotte office, he added that you have to have anti-discrimination and harassment policies that are clear, and this is very important, have been vetted. Take the time, spend the money, have a lawyer who does employment law, who's litigated these cases, look over what you're going to put out there. Then once they're put out there, they need to be communicated in a way so that everyone in the organization is aware that this is something that with the HR director, with the policies and procedures that the company is committed to, and everyone's going to be held to this standard. And then once that's done, you got to have periodic training. The law changes, circumstance changes. In my organization, as you go into new markets, you can't just assume that everyone has gone onto the website, and everyone's got to be on the same page with that. And then the last piece of this is an investigation. Steve Dunn actually said that a lot of the cases that he mediates arises from conflict and interpersonal dispute, and someone either ends up getting fired or they quit, and then they go and talk to a lawyer, and to their surprise, they find out that their boss being a jerk is not actionable. But then as they talk further, all of a sudden it goes, well, there was a discrimination aspect to this. There was I can recall years ago when I was still practicing law, a company came, they'd been doing, for 25 years, they had done business in Europe. And they came over and they were seeking my firm's advice just to incorporate some things. And I just happened to ask, well, do you have liability insurance? And the gentleman said, well, what's that? And I said, well, that if you get sued, he goes, oh, that's not going to be a problem because we never got sued in Europe. And I said, well, this is America. And in all seriousness, we have in this country the most sophisticated, I think, talented plaintiffs bar in the world. These men and women are good at what they do, and they are expert at creating causes of action and getting those causes of action in front of juries. And as I said to begin my remarks, if you find yourself in a mediation and you've been sued, you're spending the whole day thinking, why didn't I invest in an HR director? Why didn't I have these policies, procedures, these trainings, an investigation. So I don't know if that's helpful, but those would be some points I would raise.
John, those are really good points. I know there's a lot of organizations that we work with, especially on the smaller end, of course, where they either have one HR person or no HR people, and sort of someone else like the COO or the CEO is doing HR, and they really don't know how to do it. They don't know anything really much about the law, or sort of training and policies and that kind of stuff. So, and that's where a lot of conflict can stem from. I had a question. I was wondering, do you have an opinion on companies in their employment agreements putting clauses in that require mediation or arbitration before people are, in terms of mitigating the risk, it requires that step before, lawsuits can be brought?
Jeremy, mediation is always a good idea. I will tell you.
Yeah.
That was supposed to be kind of funny. It was, I guess that didn't come across as, it's how I make my living. So yes, I'd always say that mediation is a good idea. But seriously, we have a mediation and an arbitration clause in our agreements. Thankfully, we've not had that. One of the things you were saying that not only was I an attorney, but when I started this organization in 2000, it was me and my truck. I mean, I drove around I was everything. And I think one of the things I look back on and wished I'd adopted earlier is putting people in place that understood conflict and understood creating this space. I'm probably the oldest one on the panel. When I came out of school, it's just amazing at how employees have changed over time. I mean, I remember my boss, the head partner of the firm said, I don't get headaches, I give them. And he was only half kidding about that. You had a right to sit at your desk, work long hours, shut up, and then over a period of time, maybe you'd reach some kind of financial reward. That's not where we are now. Employees have different expectations. What motivates them, what keeps them satisfied and committed to their organizations, morale. The things that you guys do are so important. I don't know, you could tell me. I would imagine that 15, 20 years ago, this industry didn't really exist. The employees look, what do you mean? I didn't know I was allowed to have an opinion, let alone express an opinion. So I wished I'd gotten on board with this earlier. I think that the smart entrepreneurs now will be aware of the folks they're hiring, aware of what the current environment is, and be really proactive in creating these kind of environments and letting their employees know that, hey, for those who work for me, we're about this. If you want to come work for us, know that we embrace these policies, these procedures for resolution. We want to hear from you. We want you to make us better.
Yeah. Makes me curious as to why wouldn't a company put a mediation clause in their employment agreement? I mean, I assume that if they're dealing with unions, that's a whole separate issue. But if it's just direct employment, what would be the downside of putting a clause?
Yeah, I think that most do. I think the larger issue could do another whole thing on this is arbitration. I'm a huge believer in juries. We could spend the rest of the time on that. And I think a lot of people sign. See, it's one thing to mediate, because mediating is voluntary.
Right.
You come and talk. But arbitration, what a party is surrendering their right to a trial by jury. And I think a lot of people sign those things without even thinking about truly what that means. And so the arbitration, I think, clause is something that you might want to think through more. But yeah, always mediate. There's nothing bad that can happen if two sides sit down together and say, we're just at the eve of this lawsuit. We can save a bunch of time. We can save a bunch of money. Going back to what Steve Dunn said to begin with, most of these things arose out of a conflict, interpersonal dispute that morphed into, and I think both sides say, how did we get here? I'm paying these legal fees, or I can't get on with my life. How are we here? They're looking for an off ramp, and giving them the opportunity as what should have happened way back to sit across the table from someone, express themselves, be heard, with the common goal of finding a resolution, I think is always a great idea.
Yeah.
John, are there certain industries that you see have a lot more conflict than average, or are there certain industries that you find you get called into a lot?
That's a great question, Terrell. A lot, I guess everything's maybe high stress now, right? But there are industries like, for example, law firms. Those are places where you can have a lot of stress. You got long hours. You got a lot of expectations of success representing clients, that type of thing. I find that larger corporations, maybe they have the funds to invest in a conflict resolution and source, that are offered by Jeremy's company. They seem to do a better job of having this in place. So if I had to say, I would say if you have a company that maybe is between 50 and 150 employees, and maybe you're growing rapidly, and change is another one of those things, as Sarah was talking about, that people sometimes respond, negatively to change. I don't know if I like this, and so forth. And you don't have, or at least people feel like they can't be heard. You see a lot of litigation coming out of companies around that size.
Yeah, that's pretty much that's a lot of the companies that we deal with.
Is it?
Yeah. Because it's at those levels where the HR department usually isn't that big. At the larger levels, the huge companies, they have like large HR. And so we get called into those only when there's very specific expertise that are needed that they just don't have in their HR department. But in terms of conflict resolution, a lot of those HR people, they have some of those large organizations have ombuds, like just on staff. So.
And I'd be willing to bet, Jeremy, that something has happened that says, "Ooh, now we need this."
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. I think it's very rare that says, "I'm going to be proactive and be looking into this before," which they should, of course. But yeah, I would think it's something. There's been a precipitating event.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually something I wanted to highlight that you were speaking to, John. That reminds me of a lot of our clients, and they'll come to us a lot of times after there's a formal complaint or they already went through an investigation and nothing was found. You spoke a little bit to that, and it's like then they come to us afterwards to kind of engage in more of a dialogue to gain mutual understanding, to fix that interpersonal, those underlying issues. And you also spoke to kind of this industry about how it's growing, and you're seeing, you mentioned, you wish you started this longer before. And I think that's something that's worth highlighting and acknowledging right now, is that it is, people are becoming more aware of it, of mediation, of ADR practices in general, and this concept of conflict resolution in the workplace, and peace building in the workplace, where it used to be kind of something that's only talked about with large scale macro level wars and international relations, and now we're starting to utilize it in our own backyards, in the workplace, in our families. And I'm just seeing a glimmer of hope in the fact that this industry is growing, and hopefully sooner rather than later, people will start to do more preventative work versus something bad happened and now we need help kind of thing.
I'd be willing to say, Sarah, there's very few people that go through a lawsuit who aren't calling Jeremy the next day. So it's a hard way to learn the lesson. But as I said, litigation is on the rise. It has been for a number of years. ADR, alternative dispute resolution, is very much a growth industry, and it is directly, I think, related to the growth in litigation. And then you guys, this industry will grow commensurate with that, because again, no one, people want to get back to what they do, whether they're a service company, whether they're a manufacturer, they want to get back to what they do. A lawsuit conflict detracts from the goal. So investing that money is well spent.
That's really good. I think I'd like to move on to our final question here before we move on to our Q&A session. And this will be directed to Jeremy. Jeremy, can you talk about the best practices regarding assessments and preventing conflict?
Yeah, I'm a big believer and I hope practitioner of measuring things and then doing something with those measurements. So when we go to companies, a lot of times we find that either they're taking measurements or they're not, and they're not doing anything with them, or they're not taking measurements. So I'll break this idea down into if we want to, prevent conflict, if we want to kind of keep a pulse on how our employees are doing. I know a lot of companies do employee engagement, employee satisfaction surveys. That's certainly helpful. If you did something that's a little bit more focused on conflict, that would be helpful too. There's all kinds of companies now that are like technology companies that you could sign up for a very minimal cost. You could just Google, employee conflict survey, employee engagement survey, and there's all kinds of companies that you can hire, and they do this kind of thing, and they provide you all kinds of data. And so I think that's important. There's larger companies that are doing this already. Of course, they have their internal systems that do it. Smaller companies sometimes aren't doing it at all, or maybe they're doing it once in a while. But what I find is whatever your methods of collecting that data is, whether it's through surveys or through some interview, 360 interview process, leadership sort of check-ins, observations, whatever you're using in terms of methods, the next step is what are you doing with the data? And that's where I find a big drop off, even in large companies that are collecting data. What are they doing with it? And sometimes, just as importantly, not only what are they doing with it, but how transparent are they being about what they're doing with it? How transparent are they being about, here are the findings that we had from our observations, our measurements, and here's what we're going to do about it. A lot of companies, so I'll just give an example. This one university that I was involved with, they send out surveys to their staff as well as all their students. And it's like constant, like all the time at the end of every class, every 3 months, they're doing this same sort of surveys and gathering the data. And there was such a low, the response rate was increasingly lower and increasingly more inaccurate, because the longer it went on for, and no one ever heard anything about it. They submit the survey and they never get any feedback about what the findings are, or if they're doing anything about it at all. And so people are like, well, forget it. I'm not going to do the survey, or I'm just going to fill it out with just like, random answers. So they're getting inaccurate information. I think it's really important to do something with the data. It's so frustrating for employees to fill these things out and go through that process and to be a little vulnerable and say, here's what's going on, here's what I'm feeling, and then nothing ever comes of it, or they never hear anything about it. So that's super frustrating. So transparency is important. And then the last thing I would say is inclusivity in terms of solution building. So, you have your measurement, you have this idea that we're going to do something about it. Hopefully you're transparent in what you found and what you're doing about it, and why you think what you're going to do about what you found is relevant, what your intentions are, why you think it's important. And then the inclusivity part, which is, can you involve the people who took the survey in building some part of the solution and how you're addressing it? I know this is in large organizations, it's very tough to do that. But can you break it down into work teams or into departments? Can you have a survey just for the team? And then, whether it's 20 people or 30 people on the team, you get the team together in some way. You could even do another survey to measure, like, here are some ideas as to how we can address what we found. What do you think? And do another survey that way so it stays anonymous. Or you can have an open dialogue of some sort and write down everyone's ideas and have a brainstorming session. But inclusivity and in building the solutions to some of the problems that you find through measurement is I think an important step, because number one, those solutions then have buy-in, and also those solutions, they're going to ultimately affect all the people, all those decisions that you're going to make are going to affect those people, and they need to be part of the decision-making process if you want to mitigate conflict. So that would be my framework of like, how are you measuring? What are you doing to address the things that you find? How transparent are you being about that? How are you communicating that? And how inclusive are you about the process of building solutions?
Jeremy, could I'd like to do a little take on the inclusiveness piece. And actually, when you start to do something with that feedback, if you have a more exhaustive survey, I talk about with change management, go to the people who have the most critical view a lot of the time and let them help you identify those holes and then recruit them for the pilot or the trial. Because I've been doing a lot of work with municipalities. So people are there for 15, 20, 30 years. And there's always that person in the back that's like, been there, seen it, done it, not going to work.
Yeah.
So that's the person you want to get on board, and you want to hear what that was like. So when it goes into those pilots and trials, based on what the feedback was, I would say consider getting those people on board first.
Yeah, totally. It means it's super frustrating to take your time and give someone your feelings about how you feel at work, and then you never hear anything about it. It's just as frustrating to hear, oh, they heard me and they're going to do something about it, but what they're doing, they've already tried 5, 10 times. And so now the solution, like, what good is it? So it's all very frustrating when there's no process of feedback about, and transparency and inclusivity about what we're doing to address some of the findings that we're gathering.
Yeah, I think this all goes back to the foundation and what structures and systems were put in place at the beginning from leadership and the culture that was cultivated from that structure and from that system. Jeremy, I agree, right? That absolutely, when you're doing those assessments, you want to see change, right? And you want to make sure that everyone has a say in it. The inclusivity part is key, but who's managing all of that? Right? Yeah. Is that leadership? Who is really the decision maker? Can't help but feel like it's always stemming back to that.
Yeah, who's driving the change? And this is one thing that I think that companies, maybe one reason why they resist being transparent is because they think that if they're transparent about their findings, then they'll be forced to make changes. And some of those changes may not be desirable for sort of the long-term goals of the company, and it's kind of hard to explain that to the people that work there. So let's not say anything about what we found, and just let's keep it in the back room and talk about it there. But I think if you start changing the way you think about it and just creating a more transparent, inclusive process, you could gather the data, you could be transparent about what you found, and if there are things that people seem to want to change, and you don't think that's a good idea, at least be transparent about why you don't think it's a good idea. Like, here's what we found. It seems like a lot of people want to do this. We think that there's a challenge with this sort of change that people are requesting. Here's why. And let's create a dialogue. Let's open up a conversation about why you think it's important, why we think it's probably not a great idea. And then we can brainstorm some creative ideas to maybe get everyone's needs met in some way. But to just shut it out and just, we don't want to change in this way, so let's not even tell everybody what we found. I think that's just a losing strategy, and it really demoralizes people. And it's very frustrating, especially if you keep sending out these surveys and not doing anything about it.
Another question for you, Jeremy, so you mentioned it's hard to talk about things, but to be able to say, oh, that doesn't work with our long-term concern, right? And you talked about people not using the data. How much of that has to do, I'm going to go back to what John was saying about the inexperienced HR professional. How much of it has to do with, say, analysis paralysis or just being overwhelmed at the HR level?
It's a great question. And I would say, if you don't just check a box, don't just send out the survey because you're checking off a box. If you don't have a plan in place as to how to address the things you find in the survey or in whatever sort of measurement you're using, then don't do it. Seriously. I mean, there's no point. You're just going to frustrate people. So, I think that's something that comes along with experience. is an understanding that if we're going to do this, if we're going to take people's time and ask them to be somewhat vulnerable and open, we've got to have a plan in place as to how to address it. And I think that comes with experience. And by the way, it's never too late to change this. Like, I know it's like, we want the greatest processes and systems in place, but if you find that, you know, hey, we've been doing this wrong for years. We've been sending out surveys. Everybody's frustrated with them. No one wants to fill them out anymore. It's never too late to change. You could throw one out and say, we're doing things differently now. We're gonna, after you do this, we're gonna have a meeting. We're gonna tell you what we found. We're gonna discuss it, talk about solutions, and people will do it. And then I've seen that happen. I worked with a legal department in a Fortune 500 company, and we did just that. People did not want to fill out these surveys anymore, and they brought me in to do the survey part, and I just put it out there like, this is going to be different this time. Please take time to fill this out, because we're going to have a meeting and we're going to address things. And everyone participated, and everybody was super excited, and they actually came to some solutions that work. So I think it's never too late. And that falls in line with what we've been talking about, is the evolution of organizations, constantly evolving, constantly optimizing. Is if you have leadership that isn't afraid of change, even small change, that's super important. Sticking with the status quo and being super rigid, that's just a setup for conflict.
Sounds like intention, right? What's the intention behind the surveys? Why are you doing this? Asking yourself why. Yeah.
What's the intention, and what's the plan? Like, why and how? How are we going to address it? Why are we doing it? How are we going to address it?
And it's okay if you don't know how right away, as long as you know the why, and then after,
yeah,
you bring the team in, you bring everyone in to say, okay, now how do we do this?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's really good. I think I'd like to, if possible, just for the sake of time, I know we only have about 8 to 10 minutes left here, just to move on to one question we have asked here in the Q&A box. There's a number here. I don't know that we're going to get to all of them, but one here that I think is especially relevant to us today is if anyone on the panel could comment on how organizations can create more peace in the workplace in the era of increasingly remote and virtual working environments. It's open to anyone.
I mean, to me, it's like we're all human beings, and this medium, being virtual, remote workplaces, it certainly has its advantages and disadvantages. But to me, it's like I think it's very similar. You can create the same sort of inclusive spaces, the same sort of processes, the same sort of measurement tools. You can do all the same stuff. It's just really a matter of, I mean, unfortunately, I think it requires a little bit more meetings. And sometimes people get meeting fatigue, but because you're not around each other, and you can't just pop in real fast and say something to someone, I think it does require like regularly scheduled meetings, one-on-one, small group meetings, that kind of thing, just to feel like we're in this together, we're in this team.
I think there's also a piece of that I know that there's a fine line, but the difference in like power dynamics when it comes to being in a virtual format, and people have the choice they already have the choice of where they want to be located on this meeting, right? The environment in which they're in, but they also have the choice of, I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to turn my camera off so I can be there, but not really be present, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And again, that's like a fine line there, but I would encourage organizations to treat it like, hey, please be there. Please be present, show your face and let us know that you're really here and again, present and paying attention. So I think that a lot of that is slipping, and so that's causing teams to actually have more distance, not physically, but hypothetically, like in other ways in their working relationships, by just not being present in the meetings.
Yeah, I agree. It's setting an expectation that if we're going to be a remote work group for a while or forever, that when we have meetings on Zoom or on whatever we're using, we're going to show up on video, and that's the expectation. And if you can't be on video, please let us know ahead of time that you won't and why, or something like that. Because otherwise it really can be like, taken passive aggressively, or that I'm just checked out. I don't really need to be here or something. And it's just, it's very different than an in-person meeting. So people need to be present.
Two things I want to say really quickly. One, the phone works the same way it worked 3 years ago. When we all worked from home and we had conference meetings. Two, I heard recently, I haven't read the paper myself, but that it works really well. If one person can't turn their camera on, then everybody should have their camera off. Or if one person has to call in, there's some power dynamics. You all probably can get into this more than I, but some power dynamics there to be considered.
Yeah.
All right, great. So we have one more question, and that question is, so if a leader in an organization is unwilling or unable to help you resolve a conflict with a coworker, then what can you do?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, we can brainstorm on this one, but I think that's part of leadership's job. I would say, is there any other leader that you could go to? If not, sometimes you have to for leaders that are kind of rigid and stuck in the status quo, you sometimes have to frame the problem in a different way. Those kinds of leaders may think, oh, just deal with it. Your interpersonal style, just come on, be a man. You're at work. We're not in school here. We're not children. Like, just be, whatever, so that could be their attitude. And sometimes you have to frame it in a different way for them. You have to frame it in a way where it's going to affect their bottom line, essentially. And you go to them and you say, hey, listen, I'm having this issue with this person, and it's causing my productivity to do this. It's causing productivity in the department to do this. I could see this being a problem of losing revenue, et cetera, and framing it in that way. And that might get some fire under them.
I could not agree more, because it's taking the initiative to inform the leader that they're too a part of this, right? We're all making up this whole organization. So what the issue between the two of us is going to affect the whole, everyone, right?
Yeah.
And if the leader is unwilling to understand that, I guess I would suggest, as Jeremy said, just taking the initiative to ask to have a conversation with them, to try and get them to see that it's affecting them too. This conflict is affecting them too.
Yeah, it's going to affect their business.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for answering these and for partaking in this discussion. I think, for the sake of time, since we only have a minute or two left, I think we'll finish out this discussion. And so just I want to formally just thank our fantastic panelists, Sarah Jekovich, Terrell Holmes, John Miles, and Jeremy Pollack, for being here today. It's been such an insightful discussion for me, and I hope for all of our attendees as well. And to our attendees, thank you for attending and for your questions as well. I want to let you know that we host these panels every couple months, so keep an eye out for more discussions like these on topics related to peace building and conflict resolution. And with that, I just want to thank you again for all of you for being here, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.